Everyone. Thank you for joining us for this roundtable on fostering inclusivity in neuroimaging research. So we're going to be talking about a few different topics. So if you're here, obviously I understand that you believe this topic is important. So I'm not going to do too big of an intro, but we're going to be covering a few different topics. We're going to be talking about how neuroimaging in the way that it's historically existed and in the way that it exists now, how it's exclusionary, and then we're kind of going to go through the whole research process in terms of designing our studies, recruiting participants, acquiring data, and analyzing data, and how different biases can kind of be introduced across all of these different steps that can then lead to further exclusion in our research studies. And then also we're going to be talking about what can we do to foster more inclusivity across all of these stages. So with that, I'll let Jocelyn get started. And also one more thing that I wanted to mention, you are welcome to put questions on the app if you want, but we also want to have more of a discussion, so we're also happy to just have people shout out their questions afterwards.
Hi everyone, my name is Jocelyn, and I just want to start by saying thank you for being here. I'm really excited to start off this first part of the roundtable, which is focused on exclusion in neuroimaging research. So the fields of neuroscience and psychology have advanced our understanding of the mechanisms of cognition through scientists like yourself. We've understood the mechanisms of cognition, and we're trying to understand mechanisms within the brain. And we have found that has been true through the ideas and perspectives that we have shared among ourselves as fellow scientists. With this, the very process of science, including how we recruit, the methods we conduct, and the analyses that continue can have marked downstream effects on the equity and generalizability of our studies and on the scientific discoveries of across the global population. One important point contributing to this is just the sheer availability or lack thereof of mental health professionals across the world. This availability varies widely, and when we are if we're interested in mental health disorders that affect the brain, this is one example of something that is important to consider when we are trying to understand the brain. Another important point in this space is that biomedical research primarily includes weird samples, this being Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic samples. Here, the brain sciences face a complex and multifaceted problem in that the existing research that we are conducting is primarily in Western countries and is focused on majority populations from relatively homogeneous demographic and environmental circumstances. Another important point is that within the United States, white and non-Hispanic or Latino populations are overrepresented in human neuroscience research. A critical issue when we think about diverse recruitment is the over-reliance on convenience-based recruitment practices. These convenience-based recruitment practices can be convenient for time, location. Perhaps you're at a university and it makes sense that you have undergrad students come in, but that must be taken into account when we are trying to further neuroscience and neuroimaging for the global population. Even demographically balanced recruitment within a particular area can reflect sampling bias when contrasted against other regions. Reported that although the percentage of female scientists has increased and the percentage of publications by mixed gender teams has grown rapidly, what we see is that mixed gender teams still continue to be underrepresented in our scientific landscape today. Lastly, social identities have an important impact on brain and behavior. Our identities, ranging from access to healthcare, language, environment, and so on and so forth, all form our unique lived experiences. It is crucial to understand how these identities influence the brain and in turn behavior for the continuation of our science. I'm going to pass this on now to my colleagues, but I hope that through this talk and through the experts here on the stage that you start to think about this and the ways that we recruit, the analyses we conduct, and the methods that we use. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Erin Christensen, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research in New York. But as you probably guessed, I'm originally from Australia, and most of my research work to date has been based in Australia, and some of the stuff that I present today will be based on my experiences there. I've got experience in collecting data for neuroimaging studies and also neurocognitive task-based collection. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, and I've got particular experience recruiting samples from marginalised communities. So in rural communities of Australia, individuals who have had run-ins with the law and a history of incarceration, low socioeconomic status, and also substance use populations. But in saying that, I want to be very clear that I'm not an expert in this space. I've just tried to do the best that I can with the knowledge that I've learnt, and I want to share some of those insights with you today so that we can continue to learn together and be better in this space. So the earlier we start to think about how inclusivity and representation might look in any given study, the better. And a really good question to ask yourself is, have I sense-checked my research question and rationale with individuals or groups in which I'm actually interested in researching? And this is really important and something that can be done in a few different ways. The gold standard approaches are co-design and community-based participatory research. Co-design being involving members from the community you wish to research from the beginning all the way through to the end of the research process. So incorporating them in the study design, even as early as the research question, all the way through to analysis and interpretation of results. Another method is the community-based participatory research, which is a little bit more bottom-up. So this is where members of the community actually identify issues that are salient to the community that they want to look at, and then you turn that into a research question and study. So this is particularly good for recruitment and retention. Let me just... little sneak peek. It's particularly good for recruitment and retention because people actually have a stake in the game. Now, whilst these techniques are highly encouraged and in some instances actually required for some funding schemes like the Wellcome Trust, it's not always feasible. So another great approach is engaging individuals from the community in focus groups or reaching out to members, like senior members of the community, to get their perspectives. It's also important to note that this isn't just for when you're starting a study from scratch. These sorts of things can be incorporated when you're working with pre-existing data. Whilst you can't go use them in the recruitment sense, there's nothing stopping you from engaging in co-design or community-based participatory research in terms of the research questions that you have, how you're going to execute that through data analysis and the interpretations. And that's something that we very rarely actually consider. So now that we've got an informed research question, what are some key considerations for recruitment? And a great way to start is to come up with a strong rationale for the sample collection method. And this needs to be within the context of your research topic. So it's going to look different for everybody. Once you've done that, it's then important to develop an inclusive recruitment plan. So if you're working with pre-existing data, it's important to interrogate the demographics of the sample before starting, identify whether it is a mainly weird sample, and if so, consider incorporating more global data sets, open access data sets. There was an excellent talk yesterday about some of the really great diverse global data sets that are available out there. So it's important to consider that. It's also really important to interrogate the classifications that are present in the data. So how have they defined sex, gender, socioeconomic status, and what does this mean for your analysis methods and then your interpretation of your results? So individuals from typically underrepresented groups face some key barriers to participation. And I've got a few of them up on the screen, but the biggest one is mistrust. And this comes from, historical instances of marginalization and oppression and research abuse. So it's important to keep that front of mind, and I'll talk about, I guess, how we can counter this in a couple of slides. There are also a number of key motivators to participating. So altruism is actually a primary one, particularly for neuroimaging research. Compensation, of course, but another key one is gaining insight either into one's own condition, if it's a trial, a clinical trial, or just gaining insight into their own experiences. It's a key motivator. I like to think about recruitment as two core components. You have awareness, how do we get diverse individuals and populations to know that the study is happening, and then incentive. Once they know that it's happening, how do we actually convert them into engaging in the study and signing up? In terms of awareness, the first step is putting advertisements in places where people are going to see them. And whether you're doing flyers in the community, engaging in community newsletters, or using social media, it's really important to think about whose eyes are going to be on this and diversify your approach. So a key thing as well is thinking about the demographics of the individuals who engage in these forms of media, particularly for social media. It's something we can kind of just blanket say, oh, just do a Facebook campaign. But you have to think about who's actually looking at these ads. What sort of demographics? Facebook is more highly used by people who are 45 and above. So just things to consider around that. My favorite medium is actually radio or podcasts. And this is something that I used quite a bit back in Australia when we were recruiting a rural community of individuals. Whilst radio, you can have like this wide breadth across a number of different communities. You can also hone in, and we decided to hone in engaging in a series of local radio stations where the research team could come on, discuss this research study, and answer any questions that the community had in real time. This is excellent because firstly, you're actually engaging the community in the research. You're giving them the why, and if they're engaged in the research, they're more likely to actually participate if they care. And secondly, which I think is more important, is this fostering trust element. So introducing yourself, the research team, why you're engaged and why you care so much, it will increase trust with the community, which, as we saw, is a really key factor to consider. Then you've got the incentive. So think about, with your advertisements, what are the images that you're using and what are they saying to your target population? Think about the colors and think about modality. So get creative, use videos, infographics, audio. Text can be really unapproachable and inconvenient and really deter certain groups, particularly low SES groups and people who have, might not have if the research materials are not in their native tongue. Now, content-wise, it's also really important to think about these key motivating factors that I put up before. So fostering trust and appealing to an individual sense of altruism and providing them with personal insights so they can take home something that is a little bit more than just the cash that they get for doing in the study. So this is something that worked really well for a study that I ran back in Australia, where we we gave each participant a personalised profile based on the data that they provided us. And this was a huge motivating factor, and also really great to increase retention, because this was a longitudinal study across 1 month. It's also important to avoid sociodemographic biases in study samples, and a key component of this is evaluate your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Make sure that it's actually serving you, not just picking up what was published previously or what's done in the field. Yes, that's great way to start, but it's really important to critically evaluate whether it actually works for this particular study. It's also important to consider the sample sizes from the outset for subgroup analyses, because if you only end up with 2 individuals out of hundreds who fit into this particular subgroup, it's going to be really difficult to run meaningful analyses with that. It's also important to continually monitor and update your approach as you go. Another key piece to this is representation in the research team. As a scientific profession, we need to continue to actively find ways to recruit, retain, and promote scientists from historically marginalised backgrounds. And not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it also contributes to better science. Diverse team members provide more diverse perspectives and can lead to more diverse recruitment. And even if you're just thinking about team members who are participant-facing, hiring people who are from the community that you want to engage with or have experiences with that community can foster a sense of trust in the participants, and also really help with interpreting the data that's actually coming through. A classic example was actually from that paper that Jocelyn touched on before, which even just in terms of gender, mixed gender versus single gender publications are more highly cited and they're more novel. So before I hand over to Eduardo, the only way to encourage researchers to engage in practices that promote recruitment of diverse samples is to create systemic change. And we need to create incentives and hold each other to account. So I put a couple of examples up there of how we can do this. Getting diverse samples is expensive and it's time consuming, so we need to be factoring this into our grant applications. And if you're reviewing grants, you need to be thinking about that as well, critically evaluating whether these proposals have thought about that. Another thing to consider is journal requirements. If you're involved in building journal requirements, lobby for change. Make sure people are actually describing the rationale behind their recruitment strategy and clearly defining the target representation across sociodemographic categories. And then something that we can all do is in the peer review process, think about these things. Bring it to the attention of the authorship of the manuscripts that come across your desk, and use this as an opportunity to educate and make systemic change. So I'll hand this over to Eduardo.
Hi everyone, and thanks for inviting me to this talk. I don't know what I can say about this, but my experience is I actually work in a development country and I do research there, so I think I have a different perspective on data acquisition based on my experience, so I hope that helps and that's helpful for everyone. And which one was it? This one? Okay. So basically, we have usually an issue with the educational level, and I think it's something, it takes longer, if you want to get good data, which is what you want to get, so quality data is better than having a lot of data, then you need to really spend time with the participants. And one thing we consider in my setting at least is the educational level, because it will determine the language you use with them. And usually in my experience, they're very willing to do the work. In Mexico, it's people easily want to do, help with research, and they don't really get paid that much. However, they're really interested in this. And so, but educational level is usually a problem when you talk about, this task and so forth. So it's very important to use lay terms depending on the level. And for example, if you're acquiring several types of population educational levels, and you need to be aware of how to talk to them. In my case, for example, sometimes the medium level of education is around secondary school, so I have to really talk to that level and explain everything in that sense, because they won't tell you if they didn't understand something. They usually don't tell us, which is important to know, because they need to know everything. And this will affect explanation of simple tasks. However, as I said before here, if you're actually looking for, if your sample there have to be university students, that's fine, but if not, then you need to be aware of this. So for example, in my case, when we do tasks, it's not as easy as just telling them the task, practicing once, and that's it. It's a whole different population. My experience doing a PhD was in Denmark. And so, yeah, they're very, very different. And in Denmark, it was easy for them to do a task and just do it. And so here, I have to really spend time of showing them some of them are not really use a computer, depending on if you want all of the people, then it will take you time. Take your time, I would say. That's important. And so, validated questionnaires are also important, because for us it's not the same to use a questionnaire that was developed in Spain compared to Mexican Spanish and Mexican lexicon. So it's quite different. So sometimes, so you need to do it. You need to do the work as well and find validated questionnaires or validate them yourself. That's important. And then and consider whether this language is used and forms may alienate individuals from specific groups. And that means sometimes we work with groups that are not, so Mexico is a melting pot, so but we also have indigenous population, so it might be different for them, and we need to make sure that in this questionnaires are included. And so and we have to ensure that demographic data, for example, can be harmonized. So the more you ask, the better, in a sense. And usually in studies, at least in my studies, I do addiction and psychiatry, and so I want to have as much as the Mexican population I can, which is represented by a lot of these women. And all of them can go into my studies, and they should go into my studies. So I have to talk to them differently, I have to include them differently, and acquire data, in a way that includes all of them. So yeah, that's really important, I think. And so we have to make sure that the acquisition methods are inclusive, appropriate, not even just questionnaires, but also if they can fit in the scanner, for example, because sometimes they don't want to sit down in a way, or you have to be aware of this small subtleties that they won't tell you usually. So you need to recognize the biases of the study, like the technology. Will they have problems, taking out their jewelry or not? Those things are really important. And also, like, sometimes when you do a task in the computer, in the scanner, how do you explain that to someone that hasn't used a computer at all? So you need to be aware that they might not do it the way you want. And then when you get the task finished, you realize, I have to throw this data out, which is a waste of time, space, and everything. So I suggest take your time and collect a lot of information. In my setting, people sometimes don't have cell phones, and if they do, they don't actually look at them sometimes, or they don't answer if they don't know the number. So you have to have more numbers, like for other people around them, to contact them. I want to talk about a little bit about gender identity, because it might be a Western thing. We don't consider Mexico a Western country in a sense. However, we do have gender identity more and more. So I think it's better to ask, just because it's complex, and if you don't have it, and if you need it at some point, it's better to ask them. If they don't think about gender identity, then they will just tell you their sex. However, if they do think about it, they will be actually more relaxed when you're acquiring data from them. And sometimes they don't want to go to these studies for this reason. So yeah, better ask. And you have to provide adequate support. In my case, as I said, we don't pay a lot to subjects because we don't have the funding for this. However, there is some ways you can help, like pay for the transportation, parking. Childcare in my setting is almost impossible to do. However, you can tell them to bring their kids. I mean, if that's okay. I mean, it's usually okay for us. take care of the kids a little bit or bring the family with them. And translators and interpreters are also very difficult, and for us at least, so it's not usually possible. However, if in your setting it's possible, that's better. So that goes back to what we were saying about having multiple people in your teams, because that also may help with the recruitment. We have, I think, about 100 indigenous languages in Mexico. And most people speak Spanish, but not all of them. So it will be good. And I think the most important thing for me is the last part, which is to be empathic. So think about, your subject or your participant as a person, and see, what they need. How would you acquire data from them, and see it more like a collaboration than a use. I think it's better. And when they're comfortable, they will really answer everything you want or need. So it's okay to make them comfortable, but you need to really think about these things, and it takes time and it takes practice. So it's better to do it since the beginning. And offering the meals or breaks, that's really useful, especially breaks. I find that I like in the scanner, sometimes they just some researchers in my experience, they just go and put the task and everything. Myself, I prefer to just talk to them in the middle and say, how are you feeling? How do you think about the task, and so forth. And people tend to relax. I mean, if you have been in a scanner, because this is something we have experience with, it's awful. I hate it. So if people talk to me, I feel like more relaxed, because otherwise you don't know what's going on outside of the tube. So that comes back to being empathic. And feedback is really important. Sometimes they don't tell you, and in my setting, again, it's not people that will tell you, oh, this is, this task, I was feeling pain here and whatever. They don't tell you anything, especially if the lowest level of education, they try not to bother you that much. So that's actually really bad for research. So it's good to ask them, and they might tell you, oh, well, I was feeling pain, but I didn't want to say anything because it will affect the study. So, but now it affected the study. So because you have to ask. And that goes back also again to, if they're comfortable, they will probably tell you. And in terms of, I'm really into open science. All our data are being always shared. And so what I think about when I think about research, even if you're not going to do open science, you should acquire data as if you will share it. It will make you more aware of where you're actually gathering and arranging in terms of data acquisition. Even if you don't plan to do it, I think you should do it, like if you were going to do it. And also acquire the data and manage it in a way that anyone can actually access it and use it. And of course, you have to ask subjects in many ways, depending on the country, if they accept, how to make the data open. But I think it's important to try to open the data, because then it's not the same. Like, for example, we have, of course, you can say that we have, Latino data. But Latinos are, even Mexico has a huge different population. So I wouldn't say it's the same as in the U.S. having Latinos. So check. So can I have data from Mexico or from the U.S., California? It's not the same data. It's not the same people. So I think it's important to share as much as you can. And so you will find differences even in tasks. They're different between cultures, even within the same country. And with that, thank you. And I'll pass it on to Alvisha.
Hey everyone, so I'm going to briefly talk about how biases can kind of be introduced in the data analysis process, and what we can do when we're doing our analyses to kind of make sure that these biases aren't creeping in the way that we think. So a lot of the work that I do kind of looks at brain-based predictive modeling. So basically we use machine learning, take brain data and make predictions about the behavior data. And in the sense of predictions, it's not like we're forecasting the future, we're just looking at associations. And in recent years, there's been a lot of work done kind of seeing how these models generalize across populations. And spoiler alert, they don't. So there's been work that's been done looking at how these models and looking at relationships between brain data and cognition across different domains, generalize across different populations. So specifically, they looked at HCP data as well as ABCD. So that's Human Connectome Project and Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development. And in the blue, you'll see the violin plots for results in African Americans. The green is white Americans, and in red is a difference. And what they found is that Even though the data included these populations, there were significant differences in how well the models were actually capturing variability in cognition. There's additional work that we've done that kind of looks at across sexes. And again, the data includes both sexes, but that doesn't mean that our results will hold across both sexes. So with that, there's a really cool paper that came out last year, 2 years ago, I guess now, that looked at what is it about individuals that makes it so that the relationships don't necessarily apply to them, or they don't generalize to those populations. So they actually looked at a bunch of different criteria, and what they find is that if your individual does not fit the sample stereotype, then the results that you get for that individual probably will not be reliable. Or in other words, it will fail. So specifically, they found that age, race, education, motion, and cognition were related to how likely a participant was to be misclassified. So basically, if someone deviates too far from the norm of that sample, it probably will not work in them. So with that being said, when we have unrepresentative data, there's a few different ways that we can kind of deal with it. And some of these also apply if you have representation. So first of all, you can ignore it, which is what's historically been done in a lot of different research studies. You can also include these variables as covariates, which usually is not a good idea for reasons that I will talk about after. You can explicitly evaluate how your results do or do not generalize across different populations or different subgroups within your population. Or you can collect more data or actually exclude some data to ensure that the distributions that you have are representative of the population that you're hoping to capture. So obviously research is very expensive, collecting data is expensive, so we don't want to have to exclude data. So ideally, we just want to make sure that we kind of do all the steps that my fellow speakers have already talked about to make sure that representation's there. But if we're working with large data sets and all of that data is already there, we can actually now think, okay, is this sample overrepresented in some way? And can I actually correct for that by actually excluding that overrepresented group? So in terms of how we kind of handle it, we want to make sure that we're always reporting very clear sample characteristics. And specifically, we're using guidelines to do so. So it's very easy to just kind of put a table of like age and sex, which is what's done in a lot of studies. But there's a lot of guidelines that are now coming out for specifically different journals, as well as different funding agencies that actually provide guidelines of these are the specific categories you should use, or these are the specific variables that you should be reporting. And then with doing that, we can also actually acknowledge the limitations where they exist. So if you have a very weird sample, it's not ideal, but we can at least say, yes, our sample does not represent everyone, and that itself is a start. And then once we kind of get to the analytical strategies, we've talked a little bit about how different aspects in how you acquire data might actually introduce biases. But something else that ends up happening is if we use very strict quality control metrics, that actually often leads to exclusion of specific populations. So there's a lot of data that's kind of shown if you have very strict motion thresholds, usually you're losing more demographic diversity in your samples. There's also an interesting phenomenon where missing data itself is very valuable information because that missingness in itself is not random. There's usually missing data for specific population subgroups for a reason. So if we just exclude people with missing data, you're again introducing biases. And then again, because that bias exists, we want to avoid imputing data based on the sample that we do have, because again, now we're taking data from people that probably are not representative of the people where the data are missing and then imputing that. And we want to ideally ensure that there is generalizability across different subgroups. So ways in which we can do it is we want to actually consider the influences of these variables. So in a lot of my work, I do sex-specific research. So basically, like exactly what everyone else is doing, all I do is I separate it by sex. So then we can actually say, is there something that we see in males that we don't see in females or vice versa? And ideally, we want to avoid the use of covariates because as Jocelyn pointed out, a lot of times these variables that we consider covariates in itself is very meaningful information. So by using it as a covariate, you're actually regressing out very meaningful information that we don't want to lose. And we also don't want to use these variables as a proxy for something else. So a lot of times these variables that we typically think of as like simple ones, so like age, sex, race, for example, they're proxies for things that are more complex, like air quality, noise pollution, and urbanicity, which themselves are influencing brain and behavior. So by regressing it out, we're actually now losing meaningful information on that end. So instead, we can actually directly measure and consider those factors, and oftentimes that seems very challenging, but actually there's a lot of data out there now where if you just have someone's zip code or the corresponding kind of measure across different countries, there's linked data that you can then relate it to that actually gives you all of that information. And finally, we want to interpret our results with caution to prevent harm. So by recognizing kind of the limitations in our sample, in our data, in our analytical strategies, we can actually start to think about how that may have biased our results and then kind of think about what we could do in the future to do it better. And we want to avoid oversimplification of findings that can lead to essentialist claims. So we don't just want to say, oh, we found this in males, so this is a very male thing. We found this in females, this is a very female thing. Because a lot of times, a lot of these sociodemographic identities that we capture are not necessarily something that are immutable or innate, but rather there's a lot of fluidity within it. So by recognizing how things may change over time and kind of considering all of that and framing it in the context in which they exist, so across historical, cultural, and environmental and social contexts, we can provide more nuance into our findings. And finally, we want to make sure we're using inclusive language because we don't want to present it in a way that now actually further kind of alienates this population from wanting to engage in future research. So with that, we would like to have a discussion. We'd like to hear kind of issues that you might have faced in your research, challenges that you might have, but also specific strategies that you might be using that we're not aware of. But before we get to that, shameless plug, we're launching a special issue specifically on the sociodemographic influences on brain and behavior for the Psychoradiology Journal. So everything that we talked about and that kind of relates to this, we're going to be taking submissions for basically a bunch of different types of papers, reviews, empirical data, things like that, and you're welcome to reach out to me if you would like to submit. And the deadline's about a year from now, if I remember correctly, so lots of time. But thank you. Don't everyone start at once.
Hi, great talks. So my question was about your comment about not imputing when there's missing data, but also not excluding when there's missing data. So what would you recommend?
So what we've started kind of doing in some of our research is it's very typical to report these characteristics for the sample that you include, right? But then what we can do is also actually report it for the people that we excluded. So now we can start to see sort of, okay, these are the people that were excluded for because they didn't have great imaging scans, they didn't complete the behaviors. And then we can actually see, is there something that was very specific about that population that led to their exclusion? And if it did, we can actually go back to see if we can change something in our analyses. And because we don't want to impute it, what you can also, there's a lot of strategies that are now coming out for kind of like different mathematical models that actually consider how that participant for which you're imputing data exists within the space of all of the other ones. And you can kind of consider those factors and then, I guess, weight the data that you're putting in appropriately so it's not, say, based on that weird sample that you do have, but actually considers that participant-specific and unique variability.
Okay, awesome.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I had a question, I think, for all of you. So for pre-existing data and community engagement, it seems to me that a lot of the emphasis would be on the analysis and interpretation aspect. And you want to make sure that you're being maximally respectful of your community collaborators' time. So I was wondering if there were resources available for discussing neuroimaging, discussing cognitive neuroscience in a way that demystifies it, it makes it all less intimidating, and ensures that you're on the same page. But that seems like a daunting task, and I just wondered if if people who've already been doing that, if they've created some sort of a resource.
In terms of engaging the community in co-design and things like that.
Right, specifically for neuroimaging in this case, yeah.
I'm not familiar of any specific resources that sort of break down that, like,
For a lay audience.
for the community, demystifying and communicating science to the community. Are any of you familiar with any resources?
So this is sort of like tangentially related, but I believe it is a UCLA website. If you go to Lucina Udine's website, there's a whole section on it where they actually have very detailed videos that kind of depict that whole process of research, and specifically like being in the scanner. This is what it entails. This is what it's going to be like, which kind of gives people a lot more information about what's happening, and also gives them context into like what we're actually doing and how we're interpreting it all. And I think the other thing to kind of consider is, like, we all write a lot of papers, but we write it for a scientific audience, right? So what can we do as individuals to try and also write things for a more lay audience, or like people that want to engage, so that they are not kind of like, this kind of touches on what Eduardo mentioned about like the education aspect, like making sure we're communicating it to the community, and we're not just communicating it to the rest of us in this room.
I think too, a key piece is engaging during that research question development, because then you can get on the same page as the community that you're working with from the outset, and listen to the terms that they use and be educated the other way round. And because it's quite specific per population, that can then filter through to how you engage them throughout the whole process.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge, and even if it's in English, then for us it won't work. So we'll have to develop that. So I think there has to be more. In my side, for example, I think we need to find more funding on communication, which is challenging, but there are some, and develop that. I think, yeah, there needs to be some more development on that.
I think that a lot of what has been said is incredible. I guess just to add to this, I feel that we are in a really exciting time where a lot of these things are becoming developed by us. And so I think that we're in a point where we can really kind of set the stage of what we want to see, and like the communities we want to bring in, which should be all communities. So I think that all that to say is I think it's a really exciting time.
Thank you.
Before I ask my question, I just wanted to mention that there's a fun journal, Frontiers for Kids, which is scientists write for kids and the kids peer review. And they peer review for readability and accessibility. So I think it might be bilingual, but it's an expandable model, and it's a really cool one. So now my actual question. This might be a little bit provocative for this audience, but especially on the talk about recruiting diverse samples. I wonder how much using shared data is actually part of the problem. How much that, like, we recruit diverse people in this room, diverse perspectives, but if we don't know how to collect data, and we're not collecting data, and all that stuff, or like, how many people in this conference are using the same 1,000-person sample from HCP? That's weird. So, number one, do you agree this is an issue, and how do we solve this? How do we get more people collecting data? Because that's critical to get more diverse data.
Just before I pass over, I think a key issue is funding. If you've already got a pre-existing data set that is massive, of course we're going to use it, and we're going to pump as many papers out of it as we can. So I think a really core component is encouraging funding bodies to care and to put the money behind it. That's tricky and complicated. But I think you make a really excellent point, and the learnings that you can get from being on the ground collecting the data and actually knowing the participants that you're then analysing is just absolutely essential.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one thing, for example, I know the NIH now is actually in the US is fostering that you need to have some partner from elsewhere, especially developing world. And so that creates an opportunity to actually, acquire data for that. But also, if you're doing some data acquisition and you have funding, and you can find people here like the OHBM from other countries and say, maybe, I mean, this person is working, I don't know, Parkinson's. Maybe I should go talk to them as well and maybe acquire data. And I think the sharing part is difficult because there's always the fear of not knowing if your partner is going to be good or not. However, there are ways to know. So I think, funding, not only the funding bodies, but also like the PIs should also foster that. I think that will be better in a sense.
I have a question that people have asked me and I don't know the answer to, so I thought I would share that with you. So in my research, we're interested in recruiting gender diverse people. Some of these people are statistically like just a very small percentage of the population. So numerically, a lot of the time we're dealing with like a very small number of individuals who might have a gender identity that does not align with their sex assigned at birth. And so the question is then, how can we ensure that we can account for their experiences and what they're adding to our data set, but also account for the fact that, you know, within the data set, it's a statistically small number of people, as, you know, usually like, you know, one or two people, and statistically we can't really like group them and run like normal kind of statistics and things like that. So I'm just interested in hearing the panel's ideas around how we can foster inclusivity of people in the community that are statistically quite small.
So one thing that I would mention there is that typically in the way that gender has been like conceptualized and operationalized has been categorical, but now there are actually different questionnaires that have been developed that considers it on a spectrum. So it's like if you think about age and your average age is 30, you're not going to exclude someone because they're 24. They're like a little bit younger. They might be the youngest person, but you're not going to exclude them for that reason. In the same way, if we now consider gender on a spectrum, you're not going to exclude someone just because they fall in a specific part of that spectrum. And we can actually quantify it in a more meaningful way. And then with that, also recognizing that where they might fall on that spectrum is not necessarily like immutable. So it might change over time. There's a lot of fluidity. So it's not necessary that we have to group them into specific categories or exclude them or like not be able to consider them. But if there's ways that we can now, I guess kind of like engage with that data in a way that's different than how it's been conceptualized, that would be a great place to start. But again, I don't think I have the right answer for this. If other people here have specific ways that they've tried to capture it, we'd love to hear more about that as well.
I have come across this a lot, and it's a real pain in the ass. And where I settled, and I don't know whether this is right or wrong, but when I had 5 out of 400 participants who were gender diverse, I put in my supplementary materials and I don't know if this is right or not, but I kind of put a table that talked about their average on all the key measures that I was looking at. So I was at least reporting and showing that there was a subsample and I couldn't do anything statistically meaningful, but this is what they looked like. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
We've done similar things as well, like, just making sure that they're included in the research outcomes. But again, I'm also like, I don't know if it's the right thing to do.
I mean, in my view, you don't have to do anything about it. Just ask and put them in. That's it. And maybe in the future, there will be more data sets where you can combine them and actually ask questions about them. But for now, I mean, I think even making it simpler, it should be better. Because, I mean, if you ask someone and they don't know how to answer, then they're probably not, or maybe not now. But if they actually believe in gender identity, then they will probably be telling you exactly, what they think. So you can actually put them, put a classification or whatever you want, whatever they say, actually. And then in the future, it might be helpful or not. I mean, depends. But I prefer to ask instead of not asking, I would say.
I also think, sorry to hog the mic, I also think it's interesting from the outset deciding, okay, why do I need gender versus sex? What am I trying to get out of this? Because it's used interchangeably, inappropriately all the time. And where I landed on a lot of the work that I did, I was just interested in sex, which is typically a bit more binary, and you get a bit clearer data there. That was just my thought.
As well. It depends on what our research question is.
Yeah, but also consider that sex is actually not known. I mean, it's assumed usually.
Yes.
Unless you get
a lot of people
genetic
don't
test.
actually know. Yeah.
So again, you have that variation there. So again, just asking and put it there.
Agreed. Thank you.
Could I add a quick?
Sure.
There's another roundtable tomorrow that's about maximizing clinical utility with small sample sizes. And I know gender is not clinical psychiatry field, but I think there are concepts in that might be really useful, and the idea of like maximizing the amount of data you're getting from those small populations and framing it in a way that's like, we have subtypes of all these different things, so how do we utilize that small n? So maybe attending that would be helpful.
Thank you to the organisers and speakers today for actually highlighting this incredibly important topic. I think that sometimes we need to pull focus a little bit and realise that, we are dealing with systems that were designed that have entrenched misogyny and cultural racism, so we just have to speak it occasionally. I think that these issues are actually problematic in our community, the neuroimaging community. They're even worse. I'm a clinician researcher in clinical trials. So, and remembering that a lot of the constructs and the statistical approaches that we have come from clinical trials approach as well. So I think that, one of the ways we can get around this is to actually pool data from diverse data sets. As this audience member suggested, don't forget that Enigma does that. And, we're so reliant on the HCP and now the Biobank, the UK Biobank, and in my area, ADNI, and they're almost universally white or weird, and I absolutely love weird. So I think that as a group, we need to be maybe truly social and understand that these are, social problems. But we also need to I think we can be a bit lazy. We've got that 1,000 people, I'll use them. But sometimes I think that as scientists, we are a little bit lazy. So more of a comment than a question.
Hi, thank you for oh, sorry, did you?
I was just going to, quickly say, I think too, we're also built to function that way. Like, it may not just be laziness, it is tight timelines, it is lack of funding, it is the fact that we can only achieve anything by having that publication that goes on the CV that then means that we can continue to, excel in research. So it's kind of like a massive systemic change that we're talking about. Also just a comment.
Thank you. That's a good setup. I wanted to actually delve a little bit more into the funding side of things. So I wondered if you have any tips for grant writing for when you do actually want to study a specific, like, non-weird group, but a very specific group. Because I'm writing a grant now, so since I'm looking for help. But you could kind of pitch it in one way where you say, like, oh, we're studying this important underrepresented group of people, which is important in and of itself. Or you could talk about it more in terms of, like, almost using it like a study of biological mechanisms. Like, you could talk about, we're studying sex hormones and, we just happen to be doing it in this population. And I wondered, I can see positives and negatives on both sides. Like, the first feels, it's really important, but I guess it depends on the reviewers that you get and whether they think it's important too, and it might feel a little bit kind of stereotyping and like pushing people into that box. The second feels almost too biological and almost too kind of mechanistic and not quite celebrating the element of diversity enough. So it seems like you have some experience here, and I wonder what your thought or sense is from what both is fundable, because at the end of the day that I need funding, but also fair to the communities that we're trying to study.
So I think one thing that I'd want to mention first is completely agree with like all the things that you said, but it's absolutely wild that when we're studying like specific populations that are underrepresented, it becomes a very niche things. It's like when studies are published with like 10 people that were all white college students, no one says whatever in white college students. But when you study it in a different population, all of a sudden it's very niche. It belongs in a specialized journal. There's different audiences. So I think a lot of times it's like you can actually just include it without having to specify that you're including it. But I think also a lot of times for grants, people are starting to at least recognize, at least a portion of the population is starting to recognize that it is important. And with grant writing, it becomes especially tricky because it's like if you're writing an R01, it's like, how do I fit it in the 12 pages? If I use this space for this, what do I now have to give up? And I think it's just contextualizing it in the context of everything. So a lot of times it's like if you're studying, say, substance use, for example, and it's very, it's not necessarily that the population demographic overall of a country is going to be representative of the population that struggles with this. The same, like if you look at Alzheimer's disease, for example, there's more women than men that are affected by it, but I mean, until like 10 years ago, all the studies were done in men. So if we also contextualize it within the scope of the problem that we're studying, then it also becomes easier to be like, okay, well, this affects this population more so than the others, which is why we want to study it in that population. I don't have the right answer for this. If someone else does, please speak up. But yeah, that's kind of how I've thought about it.
I have a thought. No, I don't know. I don't have the answer. I'm just going to say that I think because you said substance use, it's mostly men that has been studied. So I would say you have for some grants you'll have to hide it a little bit, but for other grants they actually foster it. So I guess you should have to choose your grants too, but also sometimes you can actually have evidence or lack of evidence. Like in terms of substance use, we actually don't know exactly what makes like women not look for treatment, for example. So because they don't, and so is it because women don't need treatment, or is it because they don't have a way to do it, or and so those lacks, that lack of evidence, I think it's important to show in the grant, and then you can maybe convince the other ones. But I agree that you have to convince a panel that maybe mostly white men. So usually, no, but not on all of them, of course. So yeah.
I also just wanted to add that lack of evidence doesn't mean that it's not there. It often just means that it hasn't been studied. Or there's a publication bias, so it never got published because it was a null finding.
I'd like to thank you for this session. I'm from Brazil. I've been doing neuroimaging for 20 years. And that's the story of my life. Because we are trying to not, as strange as it seems, but we are trying not to be weird. Because at the end of the day, when you have actually a place that you can do in neuroimaging, you have the grant, and you still have the people that are able to go to the place. And in Brazil, we cannot pay for participants. So that's it, like transportation, let's try a community, we go around and around to get that. But by the end of the day, my PhD, I had to look, when I finally look at the data, I mean, it's completely weird. And then, but that's it, look at the data at the end of the day was excluding it, but adjust for example, education level. So we have PhDs, we have the researchers from the center, and we went to a public hospital, so we have people that have 0 years of education. So that's actually, it's part of our life. One last comment is, I think what Eduardo said think about sharing your data, even if you don't, because we are facing exactly that now, because the PD laws in Brazil came much later than the other places. So we are having a lot of issues, and some ethics committees are asking us to assign, recall the participants and ask them if they agree to now share the data, which is kind of impossible. So the easy way is, okay, we are not going to share. So that's the reality. So, and I'll be happy to contribute. Thank you.
Yeah, I know about that a lot, and I think it's I mean, yeah, it's our problems, and specifically I think we need to work around them and maybe share these experiences so we can have it. So a lot of these things can actually be fixed with funding and money, like to bring people. So I know researchers from Mexico that have money to bring people from other places and scan them. But other times it's the technology. I mean, here in first world countries, of course, they're used to people coming for them. In ours, I think we should go for them at some point. So like having low field scanners, that's a new thing, might contribute to that. Or it's tricky for us, and so we need to fix it somehow. And so I'll be happy to talk as well. Thank you.
I think too, it's important to consider that I think we typically think that is just a problem for like not a problem for America or not a problem for Australia or not a problem for the UK. And it's like, no, we have rural communities that we don't access or engage with at all. So it's something that we should be thinking about and not just thinking, oh, this is just a problem for other nations. Like this is a problem that's systemic across all of it.
Hi, thank you. Those are very enlightening series of presentations. I actually have a question about pooling samples to address the issue of diversity and what your thoughts are on, well, basically like these different samples that are being collected in different ways. So for example, even education, socioeconomic status, like they might be collected differently based on, the culture, based on this, the geography. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on pooling data that have like the variables of interest, but are, basically collected in different ways. Yeah. Thanks so much.
So there's this whole phenomenon called like the subgroup problem, which basically describes exactly what you're saying. So like an example would be, let's say you're interested in categories of like, say like income levels, for example. And it becomes very tricky if, let's say, I collected a data set with 3 groups of like the income categories, and you collected one with 5 that are not the same. So in some cases, if there's enough overlap, so it's like if my 3 if your 5 kind of fall within the 3 that I have, then it becomes easy to combine. But a lot of times that's not the case. And there's now, there's specific approaches that have been developed that I don't remember off the top of my head, but I can definitely send them over. So like in neuroimaging, we talk about like harmonizing the neuroimaging data. There's also now efforts being made kind of across sociology to harmonize like different aspects of demographic data. So it's like if you only have these categories and this is what like you're comparing to, how can you actually pool them together in a way that makes sense? And a lot of times that way that like makes sense might depend on the question at hand. So is there one specific thing that really matters? In that case, maybe it's like you only care about one category versus everything else, in which case everything else can go together. But in a lot of other cases, you do care about like that diversity. So one way to kind of handle it would also be just do it across both of them and then see if it replicates. And see if you see the same things. And it might just be, oh, this one just didn't capture enough variability in this data. That's why we didn't see an effect. But if you specifically look at this group, there is an effect. So there isn't like a clear way to do it. But hopefully moving forward, as more people are talking about it, I think there also needs to be a push to kind of like have a standardized approach, because we can ask people to collect data all the time, but if we don't tell them how to collect it, like no one's going to do it. So that I think needs to also happen.
I like linear mixed models because you can actually, put random effects there, which are random effects. So, but with enough data, then maybe you can, consider it part of your analysis. However, I like what you said. So, yeah, I'm just thinking that, linear mixed models can also help with that. Linear mixed models? Well, yeah, because you can actually, you can have random effects, which actually, basically, you're trying to account for the variance of individual things. Like, I don't know if you have a specific subject that might have a different something, age, for example, or anything. If it's a subgrouping of subgroups, then you can actually account for the variance there, and it can help somehow. Yeah, that's what we use also. And this is something we've been testing with in cross-species analysis, which is basically trying to have similar age equivalences between different species, and something simple like equating, which is used for testing, like trying to have, if you have different tests with, it's different tests because they have different questions, but actually the scores should be similar. So you basically equate both of them, and so you put them in the same scale, basically, and so you have a reference. So something like that might help, maybe, but I prefer to use the other way. I don't know if that makes sense.
Do we have some more time? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we're already running over, but we're not getting kicked out, so I think we're fine.
Okay, so maybe a little bit provocative question. Why should we care about generalizable samples? So in my mind, a generalizable sample doesn't really apply to anyone. And we're here, diversity is important. Isn't it a better idea to actually test specific underrepresented groups instead of trying to increase the generalizability of the samples? That's what I've been thinking all this time, so.
So I think you're absolutely correct, and it's especially kind of like important to think about it in the context of like funding, because I mean, like, let's be honest, like money dictates everything for most of our research, and it can be very difficult, like you said, to have a very generalizable or like diverse population across all aspects of diversity or like all of these different variables. But what we can now start actually doing is like if, and this kind of goes back to something that I said earlier, if there's a specific population where the thing that you're studying really matters, we can actually now just start studying that specific population. Like maybe we don't need a weird sample to study something that's only happening in one population. That's where it matters, so why not just study them? And then it's also like, it's a more efficient way to spend that money because there's like a bigger reward and there's a bigger impact, because that is where eventually you want to have that clinical utility or like improve their health overall.
I think flipping the script is an excellent way to approach it, and we should be thinking about that more. It's a really good point.
Sorry. I just wanted to say, because we really hear a lot about, increasing the diversity of the samples, but I don't think that's where we should be going. I think we should be really focusing on those specific subgroups instead of increasing the representativeness, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. I think there are, different ways to approach this. One way I think about is that, for example, if the United States has a lot of money towards research and one of the largest scientific funders in the world, then perhaps there should be more expectation with that privilege that we are going out of our way to increase diversity. I also think about how with, especially for one example, prediction psychiatry. Now, I know we're far away from this, but if we're building, these models that are, for example, working for white Americans and not Black Americans, when we are considering something like a depression diagnosis or suicidal ideation, I mean, in the future, that really could be life and death. So I think that both that we have to increase the generalizability for everyone for the sake of science, not only because it's right, but because, lives perhaps could really depend on this. And so that's where I'm kind of thinking. But I think you bring up a good point that we should consider.
So, sorry, I just came back because there were so many conversation points about funding agencies, and I'm at NIH. I'm with the National Institute on Drug Abuse, to be specific. And I just wanted to reiterate the points that were already brought up by the panel, that for substance use disorders, at least, the populations who are disproportionately impacted are also the ones who are underrepresented in our research. So at least from a programmatic perspective, we absolutely value the justification in terms of the populations impacted. I should note that in review, I don't know if that point is well appreciated. So it's a conversation that just needs to keep happening. So there might be some misunderstandings about what the NIH expects in terms of inclusion. The other comment I just wanted to make was that in addition to our, our general funding announcements, we also have the NIDA Racial Equity Initiative that has a host of funding announcements specifically targeting health equity. So if anyone's in the US and applying for funding in this space, I strongly encourage looking at our suite of funding opportunities. Thanks.
All right, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for really engaging in the discussion. That was super meaningful, and we're glad you chose to skip lunch to be with us. But definitely, come talk to us. We'd love to learn more about what you're doing, any ways in which that perhaps we can kind of work together to address some of these tough questions, because a lot of the stuff that was brought up, it's like none of us have the right answer, but collectively, hopefully, we can work towards a better way in which we do the science. All right, thank you.